Greece is bust. We know that, right? And the Eurozone's not going to break up, right? We know that. So guess what? Greece will get whatever it needs to get in time.
Is it good news, Bob, though, that you've got recognition that there is a problem with Greece and that, to an extent, there is a solution?
Well, the solution is to write off the debt. Simple. Just do it. Stop wasting time, right? But clearly Mrs. Merkel needs her party to get re-elected next year. The Eurozone can't be seen to be doing favours for one country when another country is voting on membership of the EU. All this, I think, is in the mix, right?
They just wanted to get something out.
They wanted to get something out positive
ahead of Brexit.
Yeah,
I mean, even in the short term, this was something.
But the reality is, Greece is a country that cannot repay. So let's move to...
Can Greece grow is what I more care about. You know, the debt and rich people argue amongst themselves. I actually care whether Greece can turn itself around from... We think it's been a depression in parts, don't we? We can leave recession aside. It's a depression. Can Greece grow and actually become a viable entity? That's what we really want to see.
So most countries in a similar situation would regain competitiveness through...
exchange rate.
The currency.
Yeah.
So in a fixed exchange rate mechanism, which is essentially what it is, right? The debt relief has to come through in real wages, right? Real deflation, or the relief, the return to competitiveness. Sorry, come through.
On a significant level in terms of, you know, disinflationary pressures in the private sector there. I mean, it's a 50%.
Greece is more expensive than Germany.
Right.
It has to get significantly cheaper than Germany, right? And that's depression kind of circumstances. Can Greece grow? Yeah, if the rest of Europe is willing to chuck in enough money, you can create growth.
Institutional framework still needs working on. Still needs to be more structural reforms, and this is the point that the IMF argued. But this is the point that the IMF argued.
I would suggest that if there wasn't a Brexit vote in the next month or so, this would have dragged on and on and on, and the IMF probably wouldn't have backed down, and the Eurozone, the Eurogroup wouldn't have been so desperate to present something.
And I think Dijsselbloem made that point there when he said, look, even just a month or so ago, I did not believe the finance ministers would get to this point. And, you know, I spoke to the Finnish finance minister at the IMF in Washington, and he said it's too early to talk about any kind of debt relief.
So does that mean we're undervaluing the whole Brexit concept? If you think this is all down to getting the House in order ahead of a referendum, does that mean we're all undervaluing potential for
the EU, you know, Greece is kind of important, but not, you know, frankly, it's like a small state within the EU. The UK is critical to the survival of the EU. We know that, right? And that's why this has become such a fractious debate, right? So I think at some level, right, maybe it's just subconscious, there's a belief that, okay, if we don't sort Greece out in time, this UK thing might just mushroom.
It's not just Greece and UK, is it? I mean, we can discuss this ad infinitum, but it's every other nation that's got... Spain, where you spend a lot of time, where we have no government at the moment. Portugal, where there's been a very contentious time. Ireland, who they floundered on water taxes as well. So across Europe, there's a big Austria, where they almost picked a far-right president.
Right, so I think there's a big difference between some countries and others. So very simply put, and I'm going to oversimplify and probably get told off,
because it's me here.
Right? There are some countries which are clearly net recipients from being part of the EU, and there are other countries that are not, right, at the initial level, right? So we can talk about the secondary or tertiary benefits of membership. Right?
Biggest net recipient being the Germans, what you're saying, yeah?
No, I don't think they're the net, but clearly, you know, somewhere like Spain and Portugal,
thank you, Julia.
Which has seen, you know, a dramatic change in those
countries. You could argue that very successfully, couldn't you? Say the Germans are the greatest net recipient because of the low exchange rate, whereas actually having an abnormally high exchange rate for those southern Europeans makes them net, rather than recipients, actually make them giving a little bit more than perhaps they should, because the economic fundamentals which you mentioned on the exchange rate mechanism redressing isn't happening.
Well, it's not happening, but I mean, you kind of blaming Germany is, I think, a little wrong, because I think Germany took a long, hard look at itself some years ago and said...
Are they a net recipient?
Through trade, yeah, but look, they went through a very painful restructuring process of their economy.
Yeah, in 1990s, yeah.
Right, but I think these things, like the Thatcher reforms, the Reagan reforms, had a very long-term impact.
You know, I always find the arguments from people who are of the more bearish persuasion very compelling when I hear them. I start to worry about my well-being when I hear the kind of stuff you're talking about as well. I look at my family's economics, but where on earth are you going to put your money if you're not going to put it in the stock market, which is yielding in the US circa 3% and in United Kingdom, for instance, north of 4%?
So I think, you know, I'm not one, you know, I think the more successful people that I talk to, because clearly, you know, I'm not one of them, right?
Well, you're pretty successful.
I think there's a big focus on real assets.
Yeah. But is that creating bubbles? I mean, you mean property, do you, or infrastructure projects? Private finance for these kind of things.
Artwork, cars, property, whatever whichever versions of it you want to. Right? But the the thing is, the gig here is money is cheap. They're giving me money. As I'm a high net worth individual or a big corporate, I can access that money because your normal citizen can't, right? In reality, right?
Sure.
I can access that money, and there's an asset bubble. Look, the Fed's policy is to create an asset bubble to generate some trickle down, to eventually get to kid the consumer that they should start borrowing money again and consuming it. It hasn't worked so far.
Okay, let me give you
second bit.
A blank sheet. Here we go. A blank sheet of paper. I've just made you Janet Yellen. How exciting. You are now the chair of the Federal Reserve. What's the first thing you should be doing?
Chair of the Federal Reserve.
I've just made you one of the most important people in this, not that you aren't already.
So,
We'll think you're getting 2 weeks holidays as well.
The first thing I would do, and hopefully this will segue us into something else I'd like to talk about, is I would turn around to Washington and say, I'm not doing any more.
Yeah.
It's up to you to fix this now, because this requires fiscal policy, right? So Washington needs to. That's what I would do if I.
And that's the same as Mr. Draghi should do in Europe as well.
Yes.
So we're done, guys. It's up to you. Same as Kuroda should be saying.
Because all they're doing is distorting markets.
Do you know what? I've done my bit. It's your turn.
Yeah. Now, don't laugh, but if Mr. Trump is elected president as a Republican, and you have a Republican Congress, you might get a fiscal package going. But if Mrs. Clinton is elected president, and you have a Republican Congress, which is what you're going to have for another 2 years, give or take, I don't think we're going to get any fiscal policy in the US either.
So the point you're making is a Trump presidency is not as economically
hit
and miss as people have feared. Because let's face it, I think it was the Post about a month ago picked up on a speech by Mr. Trump and said his economic plans, his posturing would require double-digit GDP growth for the entire 8-year term of 2 presidencies, i.e. between 13 and 24% GDP growth in order to get rid of the debt, like he said. So if we ignore some of those more extreme claims of his, actually you think it could be fiscally sensible?
I think working with Congress, he could be. So Ryan's already kind of making noises that they may be able to work together. Not publicly, I'm going to work with him, but you can see in the background. And here's the other reality, right? There is one government in the world that could issue as much debt as it wants, and the rest of the world would suck it up, and that's the US. Because the US is the reserve currency, the dollar is the reserve currency, and the whole world is always short dollars, effectively.
This is fascinating. So, is the Trump campaign, in your mind, and you've been watching it, actually working on this credible financial representation now? Because up till now, to be fair, the commentary from very serious players has been, well, it's a bit of a joke what he's saying as well, but actually now he looks like he is the presumptive Republican candidate, is the correct terminology for it. And he's only 3 points behind Mrs. Clinton in one of the latest polls as well. Actually, his economic credibility, and as her own husband said many years ago, it's about the economy, stupid.
Yes.
So his own economic credibility, that could be the key battleground?
I think so, because I think with Clinton, the risk or the picture that he can paint, for example, Trump could paint, is she's just a continuation of the Washington status quo. And in that world, we're not going to get any fiscal policy that redirects wealth or the returns away from the owners of capital to the workers. And that's essentially what there's a kind of a socialist policy, but that's what we need, right? Because you kind of con the consumer into using debt to consume, but that gig's done. That blew up in 2008. So you actually need to pay people more in real terms, which means stock owners, in reality, getting less.
So, okay, so let's take this back to your even more familiar ground, which is markets. If you get that combination, which obviously we'd find out about in November, it would take in effect in January,
so for me,
February.
a game changer for me.
Game changer.
I think, look, if the noises out of the GOP are right and
and I agree. Ryan's been making positive comments.
That to me would be, I think, potentially a massive game changer.
He got backing overnight from someone, Santorum, wasn't it? I'm pretty sure Rick Santorum endorsed Trump overnight as well.
It's not because I think Trump himself would be the game changer, but it might open up.
Do you know, Bob, I didn't expect this to be the headline for you today, but the headline from you is Trump presidency could be good for the US economy and good for the world system and good for the market.
But please, on the headline, say it's not a comment on Trump himself, it's a comment on the fact that you have a presidency and a Congress which are aligned.
But in what way, and if you look at Trump's previous comments, he's pledged to try and change the tax code, for instance, pass a tax cut that loses about 9.5 trillion in revenues over the next decade. That's been one of the headlines that's really come out of his dialogue. Are you saying that if you do get a fiscal package, it's this type of tax cut that you'll be looking for, or is it more widespread on like defence spending?
What I'd love to do, what I'd love to see if I was in charge of the world, is to say to stop letting politicians decide where money is spent, i.e. pork barreler, to avoid pork barreling as much as possible. And this debate goes on in Europe, how much wastage is there, what's the real fiscal multiplier, how much wastage is there in fiscal policy. In Japan, it's the same thing.